Yeah. The sky turned completely dark. The sky turned completely dark. Yeah. Yeah, the sky turned completely dark right around 3:45. A heavy sheet of water strictly washing the avenue floor. I popped the black canopy open, hearing the physical snap. Caught completely in the middle of a heavy metropolitan trap. The leather boot stepping carefully, entirely over the crate, embracing the absolute heavy rhythm of the physical fate. A distant saxophone bleeding strictly from a basement bar, mixing perfectly with the heavy tires of a passing car. The yellow street lights reflecting completely on the wet street. A heavy visual masterpiece entirely beneath my physical feet. I grip the wooden handle strictly with the heavy tight hold, navigating entirely through the absolute physical code. Every single heavy raindrop playing the physical drum fill, keeping the absolute heavy metropolitan atmosphere completely still. The city is weeping, strictly under the heavy gray sky, watching the reflection of the street lights slowly wash by. We walking in the rhythm, completely hidden in the rain, washing away the absolute heavy metropolitan pain. Yeah, the jazz is playing softly, directly in the cold air, gliding through the puddles completely without a single care. The heavy water pouring strictly down the corner drain, a perfectly orchestrated, undeniable physical strain. I pull the trench coat collar directly up to my chin, a silent heavy battle that the weather is trying to win. But I am strictly moving smooth beneath the absolute dome, making the wet physical pavement entirely feel like home. The upright bass walking perfectly in the physical background, a massive, undeniably heavy and beautiful street sound. A couple rushing strictly by, holding a newspaper high, trying entirely, completely to stay absolutely physical dry. But you gotta completely embrace the heavy atmospheric mood, exactly how the absolute heavy street legends completely understood. The drop strictly sliding right down the edge of the black cloth, exactly like a heavy physical, undeniably ancient mob. The city is weeping, strictly under the heavy gray sky, watching the reflection of the street lights slowly wash by. We walking in the rhythm, completely hidden in the rain, washing away the absolute heavy metropolitan pain. Yeah, the jazz is playing softly, directly in the cold air, gliding through the puddles completely without a single care. The heavy neon sign flickering completely right through the mist, an undeniable heavy physical detail that cannot be missed. The jazz trumpet strictly answering the heavy thunder roll, healing the heavy exhaustion entirely inside the street soul. I stop strictly at the intersection, waiting for the red light, a solitary heavy figure completely absorbing the night. The heavy water splashing directly yet from the physical curb, a beautiful heavy silence that nobody can strictly disturb. The rhythm of the precipitation perfectly strictly keeps the time, orchestrating the absolute heavy undisputed physical rhyme. We entirely completely moving exactly at a steady slow pace, taking up a heavy physical undeniably permanent space. The canvas umbrella blocking the absolute heavy downpour, leaving the heavy physical avenue completely asking for more. The city is weeping, strictly under the heavy gray sky, watching the reflection of the street lights slowly wash by, We walking in the rhythm, completely hidden in the rain, washing away the absolute heavy metropolitan pain. Yeah, the jazz is playing softly, directly in the cold air, gliding through the puddles completely without a single care. Yeah. The heavy storm completely, strictly starting to slowly fade out, knowing exactly what the heavy metropolitan struggle is about. The heavy clouds parting just enough to completely show the moon, and in the absolute heavy physical jazz melody entirely too soon. But the puddles strictly hold the memory of the heavy rainfall, answering the absolute undeniably heavy physical street call. I lower the heavy umbrella, shaking the physical water off, hearing the heavy distant undeniably physical street car. The air is entirely, completely, strictly smelling incredibly clean. The absolute sharpest heavy metropolitan physical scene. We entirely, completely, strictly conquered the physical wet block, moving entirely smoothly against the heavy physical street clock. The heavy jazz sample strictly echoes metropolitan rain. The city is weeping, strictly under the heavy gray sky. One gray sky, watching the reflection of the street light slowly wash by, slowly wash by. We walking in the rhythm, completely hidden in the rain, washing away the absolute heavy metropolitan pain. The jazz is playing softly, directly in the cold air, gliding through the puddles completely, without a single care.
Yeah, you gotta completely feel the rhythm of the drops. Nothing but the wet pavement and the upright bass. Keep the black canvas strictly tilted against the wind.
Yeah. Put your ear completely, strictly to the pavement. You can hear the heavy pulse before you even see the physical sun. The city is a massive machine, and it absolutely never stops breathing. Let the heavy bass strictly match the sound of the asphalt. We dropping the heavy metropolitan groove. Listen to the block. Stepping straight out the heavy iron gate onto the cracked concrete. The thick morning humidity strictly wrapping around the physical street. The heavy sanitation truck rumbling right down the narrow lane, providing the absolute first note of the metropolitan strain. A couple kids bouncing the heavy leather basketball against the brick, creating a massive undisputed rhythm that is undeniably thick. You don't need a heavy studio to completely catch a fresh beat. The absolute masterpiece is written completely underneath your feet. I watch a heavy black Tahoe rolling strictly down the avenue, cutting perfectly straight entirely through the morning dew. The heavy rubber tires strictly slapping against the physical tar. The absolute undeniably heavy anthem of the metropolitan star. We moving strictly in sync, completely with the heavy traffic flow, exactly where the absolute true physical street hustlers go. The concrete jungle is playing a heavy metropolitan song,
Exactly where the physical street legends completely belong.
the heavy siren strictly crying completely in the distant air.
While we are strictly moving through the avenue without a care.
Yeah, the heavy rhythm is exactly
Completely deep in my bones,
navigating
completely flawlessly.
through the metropolitan stone. The midday sun completely beating strictly on the physical block. The heavy shadow slowly moving exactly like an analog clock. I post up strictly against the heavy chain link fence. The physical metropolitan energy is absolutely strictly intense. You hear the heavy muffled jackhammer tearing up the physical road, adding a heavy aggressive layer strictly to the neighborhood code. A classic Chevrolet Impala strictly scraping the physical ground, pushing out the absolute maximum undeniably heavy street sound. The hydraulic switch is strictly clicking perfectly in the physical groove, dictating exactly how the heavy metropolitan physical bodies move. The undisputed strict conductor strictly orchestrating the noise, balancing the absolute heavy chaos exactly with the physical poise. It is a massive heavy symphony, completely written in the gray dust, built entirely, completely, strictly on the physical street. Trust.
The
Concrete jungle is playing a heavy metropolitan song,
exactly where the physical street legends completely belong.
the heavy siren strictly crying completely in the distant air.
While we are strictly moving through the avenue without a care.
Yeah, the heavy rhythm is exactly
Completely deep in my bones,
navigating
completely flawlessly.
through the metropolitan storm. The heavy neon signs completely strictly buzzing in the physical dark, throwing a heavy color glow completely right across the local park. The tempo strictly changes completely exactly when the moon arrives, dictating the absolute heavy rhythm of the metropolitan life. The heavy metal fire escape completely rattling entirely in the wind. A heavy physical reminder of the heavy physical places we've been. I hear the heavy glass shattering completely in the distant alleyway. A heavy physical conclusion to the absolute undeniable physical day. But the heavy bass line strictly keeps completely rolling through the night, keeping the heavy physical metropolitan vision absolutely bright. The heavy footsteps completely strictly echoing on the empty street, synchronize it completely entirely with the undeniable heavy beat. The heavy physical metropolitan jungle completely claiming its absolute own, standing absolutely undefeated, strictly on the physical concrete throne. The concrete jungle is playing a heavy metropolitan song, exactly where the physical street legends completely belong. The heavy siren strictly crying completely in the distant air,
While we are strictly moving through the avenue without a care.
yeah, the heavy rhythm is exactly
Completely deep in my bones,
navigating
completely flawlessly.
through the metropolitan stone.
You absolutely gotta completely feel the heavy physical frequency. It is an absolute, undeniable metropolitan physical emergency. The heavy architecture, completely, strictly dictating the entire sound. The heavy roots, entirely, completely, strictly buried underground. The undisputed heavy champions, completely, strictly playing their part, carrying the heavy concrete rhythm entirely, exactly in their heart. Strictly surviving, completely, exactly on the heavy physical instinct alone, carving an absolute physical empire directly into the metropolitan stone. The heavy rhythm, completely, strictly keeps entirely moving completely ahead, remembering every single heavy physical word the avenue said.
Yeah. Leave the noise on the pavement. Push those heavy oak doors wide open. Step into the sanctuary. No sirens in here, no screeching tires. Just the quiet hum of the ceiling fan and the smell of ancient paper. This is a 90s slow production, dedicated to the architects of words. Find your favorite aisle. Let the Rhodes piano completely set the mood. Listen to the silence. Listen to the silence. Yeah. Yo, the concrete jungle is loud, the avenue is a mess. I'm stepping off the block to strictly decompress, walking up the marble steps of the public domain, seeking a little shelter from the metropolitan rain, pushing through the heavy doors, leaving the chaos behind, entering the absolute greatest gymnasium for the mind. The air is feeling thick with the scent of polished wood, a different kind of hustle that is perfectly understood. I take a slow walk strictly down the central hall, looking at the massive portraits hanging right on the wall. Got the Walkman clipped tight right onto the belt, the most profound physical silence that I ever felt. I find an empty heavy table sitting in the back right, getting ready to strictly elevate my mental sight. Lost inside the aisles underneath the yellow light, turning heavy pages deep into the quiet night, building up the vision, catching inspiration spark, gathering the ancient wisdom hidden in the dark. Yeah, the streets are always rushing, moving way too fast, but I am finding absolute peace inside the heavy past. I lead a heavy canvas bag, resting right on the chair, walking through the towering shelves without a physical care, running my fingertips strictly over the leather spines, looking for the classic rhythms and the original lines. Every single dusty volume holding a heavy soul, taking my imagination entirely under control. I pull a massive encyclopedia right off the wooden rack, carrying the heavy knowledge completely straight on my back, searching for the perfect concepts for the physical script, making sure the mental arsenal is fully equipped. It ain't about the street corners or the heavy chrome wheels, it's strictly about exactly how the deep vocabulary feels. I drop the heavy hardcover directly onto the desk, preparing to strictly conquer this intellectual quest. Lost inside the aisles underneath the yellow light, turning heavy pages deep into the quiet night, building up the vision, catching inspiration spark, gathering the ancient wisdom hidden in the dark. Yeah, the streets are always rushing, moving way too fast, but I am finding absolute peace inside the heavy past. Yeah, I flip the green glass switch strictly on the reading lamp, representing for the quiet intellectual camp. Pull out a yellow paper pad and a heavy ink pen, ready to strictly break the boundaries of the physical zen. The G-funk bass line softly bleeding through the foam headphones, mixing with the quiet whispers in the library tones. I hear the heavy paper turning from a table away, a community of thinkers making the absolute most of the day. I write a heavy paragraph, crossing out a couple words, flying over the philosophy exactly like a flock of birds. This is where the true foundation of the project is laid. This is exactly how the absolute heavy legends are made. We digging through the archives, finding the hidden gold, the greatest metropolitan stories that were ever told. Lost inside the aisles underneath the yellow light, turning heavy pages deep into the quiet night, building up the vision, catching inspiration spark, gathering the ancient wisdom hidden in the dark. Yeah, the streets are always rushing, moving way too fast, but I am finding absolute
absolute peace.
Inside the heavy
The grandfather clock strictly chiming at the top of the hour, reminding everybody of the absolute heavy mental power. The sunlight fading out exactly through the stained glass, watching another beautiful physical afternoon completely pass. I close the heavy cover, let out a satisfied sigh, watching the tiny dust particles floating up to the sky. The heavy script is finally finished, written strictly by hand, ready to entirely conquer this massive physical land. I pack the yellow paper pad directly into the bag, making sure my mental energy will absolutely never lag. I nod to the librarian sitting behind the main desk, concluding the absolute greatest undeniable quest. Stepping back out directly into the fading evening light, carrying the heavy inspiration deep into the night. You absolutely gotta feed the mind. You can't just hustle on the physical corner. You can't just hustle on the physical corner. You gotta read the heavy chapters, gather the words, build the script.
Build the script. Build the script.
Walking up Lenox Avenue with the leather boots laced tight, absorbing the history glowing in the physical street light. The architecture holding a century of the urban pain, while the rhythm of the ancestors flows completely through the vein. You look at the corners and see the shadows of the past, the golden era of the art that was strictly built to last. The heavy poets and the jazz men carving out a legendary name, setting the entire metropolitan universe in the cultural flame. I touch the cold iron railing of a classic brownstone stoop, hearing the distant echo of a legendary rhythm group. The ballrooms and the speakeasies faded into the gray, but the undeniable spirit strictly never went away. The foundation was poured by the absolute uptown kings, dictating exactly how the heavy metropolitan chorus sings. There is a heavy magic buried deep inside the Harlem stone, a physical rhythm that the avenue completely calls its own. From the ancient jazz clubs down to the modern city street, the undeniable heart of the borough, strictly skipping the beat. The crown is heavy, but the neighborhood wears it proud, standing absolutely tall inside the massive metropolitan crowd. Moving smoothly strictly down the heavy block of 125, the absolute physical center, keeping the entire culture alive. The vendors pushing the wooden cart strictly on the curb, a beautiful heavy chaos that nobody can entirely disturb. The smell of the roasted nuts completely mixing with the exhaust, the heavy physical territory where the absolute weak get lost. I watch the street hustlers maneuvering through the thick crowd, speaking the heavy metropolitan language undeniably loud. The fashion is a statement completely written in the cloth, drawn to the neon lights exactly like an ancient moth. The heavy canvas of the absolute undisputed northern pride, where the absolute heavy legends of the neighborhood strictly ride. The baseline completely bouncing off the storefront glass, watching the heavy hours of the physical afternoon strictly pass. There is a heavy magic buried deep inside the Harlem stone, a physical rhythm that the avenue completely calls its own. From the ancient jazz clubs down to the modern city street, the undeniable heart of the borough, strictly skipping the beat. The crown is heavy, but the neighborhood wears it proud, standing absolutely tall inside the massive metropolitan crowd. I stand entirely, completely, strictly under the Apollo marquee, the absolute heavy proving ground for the entire physical city. You gotta rub the wooden tree of hope strictly for the luck, before the heavy physical reality leaves you completely stuck. The musical legends absolutely bled on that legendary stage, writing the absolute heaviest undeniable historical page. The crowd is absolutely, completely, strictly unforgiving and raw, the absolute heavy physical undeniable entertainment law. I hear a heavy vocal harmony bleeding right through the back door, leaving the heavy physical audience completely begging for more. The heavy torch is passed strictly down from the old to the youth, speaking the absolute heavy undeniable physical street truth. The vintage saxophone completely strictly weeping in the cold air, a historical masterpiece entirely, completely, strictly there. There is a heavy magic buried deep inside the Harlem stone, a physical rhythm that the avenue completely calls its own. From the ancient jazz clubs down to the modern city street, the undeniable heart of the borough, strictly skipping the beat. The crown is heavy, but the neighborhood wears it proud, standing absolutely tall inside a massive
metropolitan crowd.
Yeah. The sun is finally dipping strictly behind the brick line. The heavy Harlem evening absolutely feeling completely divine. The corner bodegas glowing completely strictly in the dark night, providing the absolute undisputed physical street light. The heavy boombox is strictly carrying the absolute new sound, but the ancient rhythm completely entirely stays underground. We walking completely exactly where the giants used to stand. The absolute heavy royalty of this undeniable physical land. The move synthesized out entirely perfectly, strictly hits the note inside the deep pocket of the undeniable winter coat. The history in the present completely strictly intertwined, exactly like a heavy physical, undeniably ancient vine. The absolute heavy magic of the neighborhood completely survives, dictating the absolute heavy rhythm of the metropolitan lives.
There is a heavy magic buried deep inside the Harlem stone, a physical rhythm that the avenue completely calls its own. From the ancient jazz clubs down to the modern city street, the undeniable heart of the borough,
strictly skipping the beat.
Yeah, the crown is heavy, but the neighborhood wears it proud, standing absolutely tall inside the massive metropolitan crowd.
The avenue. Yeah. The avenue was completely focused entirely on the physical grind, but the absolute greatest treasure is the state of the mind. I walk strictly past the heavy crowds and the neon lights, looking for a completely different way to conquer the nights. Push the heavy brass handle of the old library door, stepping entirely away from the metropolitan war. The smell of old bindings and the heavy yellow ink, the absolute perfect physical sanctuary, strictly just to think. You got brothers on the block entirely chasing the cash, running a completely dangerous and undeniable heavy dash, but I am pulling the heavy encyclopedia off the wooden shelf, taking the necessary time to entirely elevate myself. Every single heavy page is completely opening a new door, leaving the absolute ignorance strictly completely on the floor. You gotta read the heavy chapters of the ancient past if you want your physical metropolitan empire to strictly last. Expanding the vision strictly far beyond the street, finding the rhythm where the paper and the intellect meet. Turning the heavy pages deep into the midnight hour, building the absolute undeniable mental power. Yeah, the physical chains can never hold the educated brain, rising completely above the heavy
metropolitan pain.
I see the young cats completely mesmerized by the gold, forgetting the absolute greatest stories that were ever told. They memorize the physical prices of the heavy luxury gear, but completely lack the vocabulary to make their vision clear. You gotta swallow the philosophy and the heavy mathematics to completely navigate the absolute heavy street pragmatics. I am sitting in the leather chair entirely under the reading lamp, representing for the completely focused intellectual camp. A heavy hardcover volume resting completely on my knee, learning exactly how to keep my absolute spirit free. The physical muscles completely fade when you get incredibly old, but the educated mind is entirely worth its weight in gold. I read the heavy biographies of the kings and the saints, learning how to strictly break completely out of the restraints. The warm world, it's a piano matching the rhythm of the red, planting the absolute undeniable heavy intellectual seed. Yeah, expanding the vision strictly far beyond the street, finding the rhythm where the paper and the intellect meet. Turning the heavy pages deep into the midnight hour, building the absolute undeniable mental power. Yeah, the physical chains can never hold the educated brain, rising completely above the heavy
Metropolitan pain.
The heavy vocabulary strictly changes the way you entirely speak, making sure your physical presentation is absolutely never weak. When you sit down completely at the heavy negotiation table, you gotta be entirely intellectually and physically able. The street smarts completely keep your physical body alive, but the books entirely teach you exactly how to truly thrive. I am entirely completely stacking the heavy volumes up high, building the heavy mental staircase, strictly reaching for the sky. You can't entirely completely take the heavy physical money away, but the knowledge entirely in my head is absolutely
absolutely going to stay. We studying the heavy maps and the undeniable global charts, mastering the absolute heaviest physical and mental arts. The dusty vinyl crackling completely underneath the heavy beat, providing the absolute perfect educational soundtrack for the street. You gotta entirely strictly read to completely understand the game, or the heavy metropolitan predators will entirely erase your name. Expanding the vision strictly far beyond the street, finding a rhythm where the paper and the intellect meet, turning the heavy pages deep into the midnight hour, building the absolute undeniable mental power. Yeah, the physical chains can never hold the educated brain, rising completely above the heavy
Metropolitan pain.
The grandfather clock entirely striking completely in the hall, answering the absolute undeniable heavy educational call. I close the heavy back cover and I take a deep and heavy breath, conquering the absolute ignorance, which is entirely a mental death. You gotta pass the heavy books completely down to the youth, teaching them exactly how to find the undeniable written truth. The physical neighborhood entirely needs more than just the brave. We need the absolute heavy thinkers to completely, entirely save the absolute undeniably heavy future of the metropolitan grid. Depends entirely on the heavy books you give to the physical kid. I am building the heavy library entirely inside my physical home, never completely wandering the heavy avenue entirely alone, because the absolute heavy authors are completely walking by my side, providing the absolute ultimate undeniable intellectual pride. So entirely completely pick up a book and read the heavy line, and watch your physical metropolitan universe completely shine.
Yeah. 10 stories of absolute physical history standing strictly on the corner. You can hear the heavy iron pipes rattling completely behind the plaster. Generations of footsteps worn directly into the concrete stairs. Let the heavy bass rumble entirely through the floorboards. Listen to the building breathe. Standing on the pavement looking up at the massive heavy wall, a red brick giant answering the absolute undeniable urban call. The mortar is cracking, showing the heavy passage of the years, soaking up a million physical laughs and a million heavy tears. Yeah, the foundation poured completely thick before we were even born, weathering every single heavy, undeniably physical winter storm. I touch the rough surface strictly with my bare physical hand, the absolute heaviest, undisputed structure in this concrete land. The brass numbers on the heavy wooden front door completely faded, while the neighborhood around it got completely undeniably physical winter storm. I touch the rough surface strictly with my bare physical hand, the absolute heaviest undisputed structure in this concrete land. The brass numbers on the heavy wooden front door completely faded, while the neighborhood around it got completely undeniably traded. But the heavy architecture stays completely strictly standing tall, holding the absolute heavy secrets directly inside the plaster wall. You feel the heavy vibration completely exactly when the boiler kicks the undeniable heavy heartbeat of a million stacked red bricks. These heavy red walls are holding the absolute truth inside, a massive brick monument where the physical city secrets hide. The iron fire escapes are rattling in the heavy evening breeze, standing completely unbroken with the absolute maximum ease. Yeah, the neighborhood shifts, but the foundation holds its ground, listening strictly to the rhythm of the heavy metropolitan sound. Push the heavy wooden door, step strictly into the main hall, the echo bouncing entirely, completely directly off the tile wall. No heavy elevators, just the physical absolute marble flight, climbing up the heavy staircase deep into the physical night. You hear the heavy radiator strictly hissing on the second floor, a heavy physical argument completely bleeding through a heavy door. The smell of old wood and the heavy undeniable cooked meals, that is exactly how this physical brick giant completely strictly feels. The iron fire escapes, strictly clinging to the absolute backside, where the undisputed heavy street legends completely used to hide. A heavy maze of the physical hallways and the narrow physical rooms, where the absolute heavy metropolitan flower completely entirely blooms. The dust dances strictly in the heavy
heavy physical shafts of light, maintaining the absolute maximum, heavy undisputed physical might. These heavy red walls are holding the absolute truth inside, a massive brick monument where the physical city secrets hide. The iron fire escapes are rattling in the heavy evening breeze, standing completely unbroken with the absolute maximum ease. Yeah, the neighborhood shifts, but the foundation holds its ground, listening strictly to the rhythm of the heavy metropolitan sound. The heavy wind howling exactly through the narrow physical alleyway, washing the absolute heavy metropolitan physical dust completely away. I walk the heavy corridor, looking at the peeling yellow paint, a heavy physical environment for the sinner and the urban saint. The deep mood bass completely bouncing entirely off the courtyard brick. The atmosphere inside this heavy monument is undeniably thick. You see the heavy names carved completely strictly in the windowsill, proving that this heavy red structure is completely entirely standing still. The copper pipes completely entirely strictly running through the heavy vein, pumping the heavy physical heat to block the undeniable heavy pain. It is a heavy living organism, completely strictly made of clay and stone, making sure the heavy metropolitan residents are never completely alone. A testament completely strictly to the heavy physical builders' hands, the undisputed heavy king of these physical, heavy concrete lands. These heavy red walls are holding the absolute truth inside, a massive brick monument where the physical city secrets hide. The iron fire escapes are rattling in the heavy evening breeze, standing completely unbroken with the absolute maximum ease. Yeah, the neighborhood shifts, but the foundation holds its ground, listening strictly to the rhythm of the heavy metropolitan sound. I push the heavy metal hatch directly to the absolute heavy roof, looking for the undeniable absolute heavy metropolitan proof. The black tar completely sticking exactly to the bottom of the shoe, taking in the absolute maximum undeniable heavy physical view. The heavy brick chimney completely standing strictly right against the sky, watching the heavy physical deck is absolutely completely flying by. This heavy red building is an absolute undisputed heavy street king, dictating exactly how the heavy metropolitan physical voices sing. The heavy architecture entirely strictly outlasting the physical flesh, keeping the absolute undeniable heavy metropolitan memories completely fresh.
Yeah. That's right. Looking back at the calendar, watching the heavy decades fade, realizing exactly how this physical metropolitan foundation was made. I remember sitting completely quiet, strictly in the passenger seat, watching the old man strictly navigating the absolute heavy street. The heavy hands resting perfectly entirely on the steering wheel, teaching me exactly how the absolute genuine street respect should feel. He worked the heavy shifts, carrying the physical burden all alone, building up our massive castle completely strictly out of heavy stone. We taking those long drives completely entirely under the street light, learning the heavy difference between the absolute physical wrong and right. He never asked for a heavy medal, never strictly begged for applause, just entirely completely fighting for the absolute heavy family cause. The heavy mood bass completely matching the rhythm of his old ride, filling up my physical chest completely with an undeniable heavy pride. They carried the heavy weight so we could entirely touch the sky, wiping away the physical tears every single time we had to cry. Built a heavy undeniable shelter entirely out of love and trust, protecting the physical family completely from the heavy metropolitan dust. Yeah, the undeniable heavy debt is something I can never repay, just honoring the heavy sacrifices entirely every single day. I step strictly through the heavy wooden front door from the cold air, feeling the absolute heavy physical safety entirely waiting there. The heavy smell of the warm dinner completely waiting strictly on the stove, the absolute heavy center of our entirely physical treasure cove. I watch my mother strictly standing completely entirely by the flame, making sure the heavy metropolitan exhaustion never entirely overcame. She stitched the heavy physical fabric entirely completely holding us tight, chasing away the absolute heavy shadows hiding in the physical night. The heavy pods entirely strictly clinking in the physical background noise, creating the absolute
absolute perfect harmony for the physical girls and boys. She sacrificed a heavy dream strictly so I could entirely chase my own, planting the absolute heavy, undeniable physical seeds that I have grown. No heavy diamonds, entirely strictly shining upon her physical hand. But she is the absolute heavy, undisputed queen of this physical land. They carried the heavy weight so we could entirely touch the sky, wiping away the physical tears every single time we had to cry. Built a heavy, undeniable shelter entirely out of love and trust, protecting the physical family completely from the heavy metropolitan dust. Yeah, the undeniable heavy debt is something I can never repay. Just honoring the heavy sacrifices entirely every single day. The physical envelope on the table entirely filled with the past due bills. A heavy physical mountain that entirely completely tested their absolute wills. But they entirely completely strictly shielded me from the heavy stress, making sure my physical childhood was an absolute undeniable success. I thought the heavy clothes on my back completely strictly grew on trees, never seeing the heavy physical hours that brought them to their knees. The heavy acoustic guitar picking entirely completely strictly in the groove, dictating entirely how the absolute heavy family physical units move. They gave me the heavy armor to completely strictly face the avenue, providing the absolute heavy physical, undeniable, pure and honest view. Every single heavy dollar entirely strictly stretched to the absolute edge, standing completely unbroken entirely upon the heavy physical edge. I look at the heavy physical wrinkles entirely mapping the physical face, an absolute masterpiece of the entirely undisputed physical grace. They carry the heavy weight so we could entirely touch the sky, wiping away the physical tears every single time we had to cry. Built a heavy, undeniable shelter entirely out of love and trust, protecting the physical family completely from the heavy metropolitan dust. Yeah, the undeniable heavy debt is something I can never repay. Just honoring the heavy sacrifices entirely every single day. Now I'm entirely, completely standing exactly on my own 2 feet, walking entirely confident, strictly down the absolute heavy physical street. And every single heavy step I take is entirely dedicated completely to them. The absolute, undeniably heavy physical rooted the metropolitan stem. I pour a heavy glass of strictly, completely, entirely premium wine, making entirely sure the absolute heavy family tree is doing completely fine. We keeping the entirely undeniable physical legacy absolutely alive. The ultimate heavy reason that I strictly, entirely continue to strictly strive. The heavy 90 slow rhythm, completely, entirely, strictly playing for the old school, following the absolute, undeniably heavy golden physical family rule.
Yeah. I take a slow walk. Yeah, I take a slow walk strictly down the familiar neighborhood block, listening to the steady rhythm of the heavy NLR clock. They knocked down an old diner, built a massive heavy high rise, putting a completely different picture right in front of my physical eyes. The homies I used to know were wearing completely different gear, trying to perfectly blend entirely into the heavy atmospheric fear. Yeah, chasing every single heavy trend that the metropolitan wind blows, changing up their entire rhythm strictly just to match the new clothes. But I am wearing the exact same heavy canvas jacket I always had, refusing to completely lose my mind over a temporary street fad. You look around and see the heavy foundations entirely shifting fast, but I am strictly built completely from the heavy, undeniable physical past. It is a heavy temptation to entirely strictly switch up your chosen lane, but keeping your true physical soul is the absolute ultimate game. The world is spinning fast, the seasons completely turn around, but I am keeping my heavy boots entirely planted on the ground. The colors fade away, the heavy city changes its entire face, but I'm holding my original, undeniable, heavy physical space. Yeah,
the winds of change are blowing entirely cold and severe. But exactly who I am is absolutely remaining strictly here. I see the cats on the corner completely strictly altering their voice, making a completely undeniably heavy physical artificial choice. They wanna fit perfectly entirely into the new metropolitan mode, trading the absolute heavy genuine truth for a piece of fool's gold. They tell me I gotta update my heavy physical undeniable style, but I just look at them strictly with a heavy and knowing smile, because the trends absolutely completely run entirely out of gas, while the absolute heavy authentic physical legends completely pass. The test of the heavy time entirely strictly exposes the fake, showing exactly what kind of heavy physical foundation they really make. I keep my heavy circle tight, walking strictly at my own pace, protecting the absolute heavy integrity entirely of my physical space. You can paint the heavy brick wall entirely completely fresh and new, but the heavy solid core underneath has to entirely strictly remain true. The world is spinning fast, the seasons completely turn around, but I am keeping my heavy boots entirely planted on the ground. The colors fade away, the heavy city changes its entire face, but I'm holding my original undeniable heavy physical space. Yeah, the winds of change are blowing entirely cold and severe, but exactly who I am is absolutely remaining strictly here. I sit entirely, completely alone underneath the heavy evening sky, watching the heavy, undisputed physical decades strictly flying by. It takes a heavy amount of absolute courage to entirely stay the same when the entire metropolitan universe is playing a completely different game. You gotta look directly into the heavy physical mirror every single night and make entirely sure your absolute heavy soul is doing completely right. The heavy pressure is a physical ocean trying entirely to pull you under, drowning out your original voice exactly with the massive physical thunder. But I am anchoring my heavy roots entirely deep into the heavy dirt, wearing my absolute undisputed heavy physical morals exactly like a shirt. Let the heavy neighborhood entirely completely strictly rearrange. I am the absolute undeniable heavy constant entirely inside the change. The smooth electric guitar strictly crying entirely in the background, matching the absolute undeniably heavy original authentic street sound. The world is spinning fast, the seasons completely turn around, but I am keeping my heavy boots entirely planted on the ground. The colors fade away, the heavy city changes its entire face, but I am holding my original undeniable heavy physical space. Yeah. The winds of change are blowing entirely cold and severe, but exactly who I am is absolutely remaining strictly here. The heavy sun is coming strictly up, completely entirely over the hill, and absolutely entirely completely standing strictly physically still. The heavy masquerade completely strictly falls apart in the morning light, showing exactly who entirely completely survived the heavy physical night. The heavy chameleons completely strictly entirely losing the physical way, forgetting exactly who they absolutely were strictly just the other day. But the heavy respect entirely completely strictly belongs to the rare few who absolutely completely exactly strictly entirely remained exactly true. I'm keeping the heavy undeniably physical original West Coast state of mind, leaving the heavy physical undeniable metropolitan illusions far behind. So let the heavy calendar completely strictly entirely turn a heavy page. I am exactly the entirely completely same man inside this golden age.
Yeah. Step past the massive stone arch. Leave the loud avenue completely behind you for a minute. Welcome to the southwest corner of the park, where the real heavy battles happen right on the concrete table. 64 squares, black and white wooden soldiers. Listen to the heavy mechanical timer ticking. A completely silent war to mind. Let that deep bass roll right under the autumn trees. Make your first move. Yeah, walking through the village, feeling the heavy autumn breeze, hearing the rustle of the dry and yellow falling leaves. I make my way directly down to the legendary square, looking for a mental challenge waiting for me completely there. Find an empty stool right across from a veteran player, an absolute master, a true Washington Square mayor. He sets the wooden pieces strictly on a marble grid, looking at me like I'm just another foolish physical kid. I drop a heavy crumpled 20 right on the stone surface, showing the old man that I have a serious absolute purpose. He hits the analog timer, the physical ticking starts. A silent war of the minds and heavy beating street hearts. No physical violence, just absolute mental strategy, trying to completely avoid an undeniable king's tragedy.
Sitting on the concrete under the city trees, playing the silent game, catching the autumn breeze. The black and white squares, holding the master plan, proving exactly who is the ultimate better man.
Yeah, the clock is running out.
The pressure is so heavy,
keeping the mind completely focused and entirely steady. I pushed upon the E4, claiming the center space. He answers right back with an absolute perfect poker face, developing the knights, protecting their heavy physical flanks, moving the wooden cavalry completely across the ranks. The old man smiles, taking a sip of his black coffee, trying to make my entire defense look completely sloppy. A couple pigeons walking strictly around the table legs, while I am calculating exactly where the master bags. I hear a distant acoustic guitar playing a gentle chord, but my entire universe shrinks down to this wooden board. He slides his bishop aggressively across the diagonal line, but I already saw the trap in my position is absolutely fine. I castle to the king's side, putting the monarch safely away, preparing for the absolute roughest part of the physical day.
on the concrete under the city trees, playing the silent game, catching the autumn breeze. The black and white squares, holding the master plan, proving exactly who is the ultimate better man.
Yeah, the clock is running out.
The pressure is so heavy,
keeping the mind completely focused and entirely steady. The middle game is entirely a heavy tangled mess, an undeniable masterpiece of the physical street chess. A small crowd gathering strictly behind my back, watching the veteran launch a heavy kingside attack. He slams the pieces down, trying to strictly intimidate the mind, but I'm leaving his absolute basic tactics completely behind. I sacrifice a heavy rook entirely for the greater good, controlling the center of the board exactly like I should. The crowd inside a heavy gas, thinking I made a mistake, but they don't see the heavy physical toll it's gonna take. The analog timer ticking down to the absolute final minute, the undisputed heavy mental championship, and I'm in minute. He takes the bait and captures my piece with a greedy hand, falling completely perfectly into the heavy trap that I planned.
sitting on the concrete under the city trees, playing the silent game, catching the autumn breeze. Black and white squares, holding the master plan, proving exactly who is the ultimate better man.
Yeah, the clock is running out.
The pressure is so heavy,
keeping the mind completely focused and entirely steady. I slide the queen directly up the absolute central fire, wiping away the veteran's undeniable confident smile. The white knight jumps perfectly, strictly to the final square, trapping the black king completely without a breath of air. I hit the heavy button on the wooden ticking clock, sending an absolute undeniable physical metropolitan shock. Checkmate on the concrete, the heavy battle is completely done. The quiet afternoon victory is absolutely strictly won. The old man nods his head, showing a heavy street respect. The flawless mental outcome that he absolutely didn't expect. He pushes the corporal 20 directly across the cold stone. The undisputed heavyweight champion holder the park throne. I shake his callous hand, reset the pieces on the board. The greatest silent victory that I've ever physically scored. Time keeps time keeps strictly moving. Time keeps strictly moving. Time keeps strictly moving. The heavy clock keeps ticking on. Sitting completely alone inside a silent physical room tonight. Putting the absolute heavy thoughts completely, strictly into the light. Wondering exactly where this physical journey is entirely gonna go, and if we ever manage to take it completely, strictly, nice and slow. I seal this envelope strictly, entirely for the older version of me, hoping you kept the physical vision entirely clear for the world to see. Did you finally park that heavy black Tahoe strictly on the block? Or a classic Chevy Impala rolling completely, entirely round the clock? I hope you still pushing that 90s slow, heavy musical sound, keeping the authentic 90s hip-hop entirely, strictly underground. The heavy ink is bleeding strictly directly through the yellow page, writing exactly from the middle of the absolute undeniable golden age. I hope the physical passion never faded completely, entirely away, and you still strictly regulating the heavy rhythm every single day. Time keeps strictly moving, the heavy clock keeps ticking on. Before you even blink, the absolute heavy physical years are gone. I am sending this message across the undeniable heavy distant miles, hoping you still keeping the heavy authentic West Coast smiles. Read these heavy words entirely completely written in the dark, and never lose the undeniable heavy physical original street spark. I wonder if the heavy metropolitan struggle entirely took a toll, or if you managed to completely, strictly protect the physical soul. You gotta keep your energy strictly ground entirely to the core, protecting the heavy relay so you can completely, entirely ask for more. Did you ever make the heavy trip entirely, exactly across the sea, to watch the Barcelona legends playing absolutely, entirely free? It is the heavy dreams that keep the physical engine running tight, navigating entirely, completely, strictly through the absolute darkest night. I hope you never traded the heavy more strictly for the fast cash. Select the undeniable heavy physical empire, completely, entirely crash. I'm writing these heavy letters strictly with a completely steady hand, hoping you built a heavy sanctuary completely, exactly, in this land. The paper is absorbing the absolute, undeniable, heavy physical truth, a massive permanent monument, entirely, strictly to original you. Time keeps strictly moving, the heavy clock keeps ticking on. Before you even blink, the absolute heavy physical years are gone. I am sending this message across the undeniable heavy distant miles, hoping you still keeping the heavy authentic West Coast smiles. Read these heavy words entirely completely written in the dark, and never lose the undeniable heavy physical original street spark. I hope you're still keeping the heavy physical circle entirely tight, and taking care of the family, strictly doing absolutely everything right. Remember the heavy drives entirely, completely, exactly with the old man, learning exactly how to completely, entirely execute the master plan. The heavy warm meals entirely waiting strictly, completely on the stove, the absolute heaviest foundation inside the physical treasure cove. Don't ever let the heavy calendar make you entirely, strictly forget the absolute heaviest physical debts that you completely, entirely met. The acoustic guitar picking entirely, completely in the background noise, reminding you to keep the absolute heavy metropolitan physical poise. I lick the heavy envelope, sealing the absolute physical undeniable deal, exactly how the undeniable heavy original street legends completely feel. We strictly planting the heavy seeds, completely in the physical ground. Wait entirely, completely, strictly for the heavy Harvey, completely, strictly for the heavy harvest to be found. Time keeps strictly moving, the heavy clock keeps ticking on. Before you even blink, the absolute heavy physical years are gone. I am sending this message
across the undeniable. Heavy distant miles, hoping you still keeping the heavy, authentic West Coast smiles. Read these heavy words entirely, completely written in the dark, and never lose the undeniable heavy physical. The wax seal is entirely, completely pressed into the heavy folded paper. A heavy physical story, completely catching the absolute midnight vapor. Whenever you open this, whether you are entirely 50 or completely gray, I hope you are absolutely, completely, strictly, entirely doing okay. I hope the heavy G-funk bass is still strictly playing in the ride, and you entirely, completely keeping the absolute heavy West Coast pride. The heavy grandfather clock strictly strikes the absolute midnight hour, leaving the absolute physical room completely, entirely, strictly, entirely power. I hope the heavy envelope directly, strictly into the heavy wooden box, secured entirely, completely, strictly by the undeniably heavy iron locks. Whatever heavy decade you are, completely, strictly, currently standing in. I hope you are absolutely, completely, strictly managing to physically win.
Yeah. So walking out, hey. Yeah, the concrete teaches you. Let's go. Yeah. Walking out the heavy double doors with a backpack full of weight. Looking at the neighborhood, trying to navigate my physical fate. I see the homies posted strictly by the corner liquor store, holding folded paper money, always hunting down a little more. They got the graduation rings from the unforgiving street, memorizing every single crack completely underneath their feet. They look at my heavy textbooks and they hit me with a smile, saying that the classroom hustle absolutely ain't the proper style. But I am looking at the long game, strictly past the physical block, reading the philosophy entirely against the metropolitan clock. The pavement gives you reflexes, teaches you to watch your back, but the paper pages show you how to build the absolute heavy track. I grip the canvas strap completely tight across my physical chest, preparing my own mind to pass the absolute ultimate test. The concrete teaches you exactly how to survive the night, keeping your vision focused strictly in the faded light. But the heavy books give you the keys to entirely own the land, building a massive physical empire completely out of the sand. Yeah, you absolutely need the balance of the paper and the stone if you wanna sit entirely comfortable on the metropolitan throne.
zone.
Yeah, the corner got its own professors preaching strictly in the dark, teaching heavy physical lessons strictly in the neighborhood park. The tuition is incredibly high, paid entirely in the blood and sweat. A heavy, undeniable syllabus that you absolutely never forget. You learn exactly how to read a physical face from a mile away, knowing exactly what the heavy street predators are about to say. But I sit inside the silent library underneath the yellow beam, gathering the mathematics to construct a massive physical dream. They study in the local block, I'm studying the entire globe, wrapping my physical mind completely inside an intellectual role. The street give you the immediate physical, undeniable cash in hand, but the education teaches you exactly how the economics expand. I watch the older street legends entirely, completely fading away, because they never learned exactly how the absolute heavy rules play. The concrete teaches you exactly how to survive the night, keeping your vision focused strictly in the fading light. But the heavy books give you the keys to entirely own the land, building a massive physical empire completely out of the sand. Yeah, you absolutely need the balance of the paper and the stone if you wanna sit entirely comfortable on the metropolitan throne. Yeah, a couple years completely passing exactly like a shadow on the wall, watching the heavy physical autumn leaves entirely strictly fall. I walk the same exact avenue, holding a heavy road degree, looking at the absolute heavy reality of exactly what I see. The same homie strictly standing entirely on the exact same corner square, trapped completely inside the heavy physical undisputed street snare. The fast money completely vanished, leaving strictly nothing behind, because they never took the physical time to strictly elevate the mind. And I shake their hands, showing the absolute undeniable heavy respect, but realizing the heavy physical outcome that they didn't expect. The street smarts completely kept them entirely breathing and alive, but the lack of the heavy paper strictly stopped them in the drive. You gotta read the fine print, completely hidden inside the contract, or the metropolitan predators will absolutely leave you completely high. The concrete teaches you exactly how to survive the night, keeping your vision focused strictly in the fading light. But the heavy books give you the keys to entirely own the land, building a massive physical empire completely out of the sand. Yeah, you absolutely need the balance of the paper and the stone if you wanna sit entirely comfortable on the metropolitan throne. So I am keeping the absolute balance entirely strictly in my head. I'm remembering exactly everything the street in the classroom said. If you only got the heavy books, the avenue will eat you raw. You absolutely gotta completely understand the heavy physical street law. But if you only got the pavement, you will never truly rise above, trapped entirely inside the neighborhood that you absolutely love. You merge the heavy vocabulary completely with the physical street slang, avoiding every single heavy trap that the metropolitan system will bring. I put the diploma completely strictly right next to the survival skills, conquering the absolute heavy undeniably physical metropolitan hills. A masterpiece of the street knowledge completely fused with the pen, creating the absolute highest caliber of the physical street man. The move baseline bouncing completely entirely with the heavy page, the undeniable absolute heavy truth to this golden physical age. The concrete teaches you exactly how to survive the night, keeping your vision focused strictly in the fading light. Walking out the heavy double doors with a backpack full of weight, looking at the neighborhood, trying to navigate my physical fate. I see the homies posted strictly by the corner liquor store, holding folded paper money, always hunting down a little more. They got the graduation rings from the unforgiving street, memorizing every single crack completely underneath their feet. They look at
My heavy textbooks and they hit me with a smile. I said, saying that the classroom hustle absolutely ain't the proper style. But I am looking at the long game, strictly past the physical block. Reading the philosophy entirely against the metropolitan clock. The pavement gives you reflexes, teaches you to watch your back, but the paper pages show you how to build the absolute heavy track. I grip the canvas strap completely tight across my physical chest, preparing my own mind to pass the absolute ultimate test. The concrete teaches you exactly how to survive the night, keeping your vision focused strictly in the fading light. But the heavy books give you the keys to entirely own the land, building a massive physical empire completely out of the sand. Yeah, you absolutely need the balance of the paper and the stone if you want to sit entirely comfortable on the metropolitan throne. The corner got its own professors preaching strictly in the dark, teaching heavy physical lessons strictly in the neighborhood park. The tuition is incredibly high, paying